Zoom? Thank you. Finding the sponsorship in a second. We begin by thanking our sponsors of the daf. We thank those who sponsored all the shiurim for the month. We thank Dr. Steve and Dr. Terry Ziv for sponsoring all the shiurim in loving memory of Steve's father, Albert Zin Banu Tzvi Ben Chaim on his 18th yard site. We also thank Leah Sol for sponsoring all the shiurim of the month as a schos for a full shlema for her daughter Ilana Bas Esther, for all the wounded in Eretz Yisrael. May all of our soldiers be safe. Amen. We also thank Yonas and Rachel Wolf for sponsoring all the shiurim as a schos for a full shlema and lasting refuah for Rafal Yitzchak, Baruch, and Esther. We also thank Jerry and Sarah Wolaski for sponsoring all the shiurim as a schos for a full shlema for Zachariah Dov and Carol Shira. And we thank Ed and Iris Miller for sponsoring all the shiurim for the month in the zechus for the holy soldiers of the Aryeh and in the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisrael. In the zechus of our Talmud Torah this morning, all those who need a refuah should have refuah. All those neshamas should have an aliyah, and all those who are being mispal should have the Yeshua ben Hira B'Karov. Today's daf is Kiddushin daf Ayin Ches, Kiddushin 78. We are coming close to the end of the Masechta and to the end of the Seder, which is a very exciting milestone. We are going to start on daf Ayin Ches and Aleph from the second line. The Gemara says as follows: Amar Yehuda. Yehuda teaches us Kohen Gadol be'almana lo kashtayim. Everybody knows that a Kohen Gadol has a prohibition against who he's allowed to marry, and his prohibitions exceed those of a typical Kohen, and therefore a Kohen Gadol is not allowed to marry an almana. He can't marry a widow. If he does marry a widow, then halacha is he gets two separate pairs of malchus. He gets lashes twice. Achas b'shum lo yikach. One, because he violated the mitzvah of lo yikach. He violated the mitzvah of lo yikach because it says almana ugrusha v'chalal zona lo yikach. So there's a violation of lo yikach as well. Achas b'shum lo yichalel. Another one because he was michalel her. When he marries the almana, he causes her a problem because she now becomes mechula. She becomes defiled because of the fact that she was involved in an illegitimate marriage. Because again, she's an almana, she's not allowed to be married to a Kohen Gadol. Therefore, she becomes defiled through this marriage. And under those circumstances, he gets malchus. So he gets malchus once for violation of lo yikach, another one for the violation of lo yichalal. Okay, Mashi? The Gemara says, okay, that all makes sense. So, okay, all this is related to him. So he violated lo yikach because he married a woman he shouldn't have married. He violated the Isser of lo yichalel because he defiled her. How about the fact that he engages in a relationship with her which can produce a child, and that child becomes a chalal? So maybe he should get a third pair of malchus because of the lilkinam mishum lo yichalel zaro, because he is potentially going to create a child that's going to be a chalal. So that's another Isser. Let him get 3 sets of lashes. Gemara says, it is referring to a case where he was intimate with her, but he did not finish the intimacy with her. Now the halacha is, with regard to a marriage, just the beginning of an intimate action is enough to complete the marriage. But in order for it to be considered a bia with regard to creating a child or the potential to create a child, a person cannot create a child unless the act of the bia is completed. In this case, it's talking about that he did not complete the act of bia. The implication of the Gemara is that if he would have completed the bia, if it would be a complete bia with Itzaz Zera, under those circumstances, indeed he would get 3 sets of malchus. So if he had a complete bia, he would get malchus number 1 for violation of liyikach, number 2 for defiling her, number 3 for the potential that he'll create a child that will become a chalal. Again, the implication of this Gemara is that even if we don't know
that she became pregnant through this interaction, or that she may not have become pregnant, but the mere fact that she can become pregnant through this interaction is enough for him to be chayiv malchus. The reason why I'm saying that is because anytime we're not just talking about violating an isser, we're talking about giving him malchus. Malchus is an action through a beis din, and something like that can't take place unless there's going to be a hasra, a proper warning. If we need to have different variables involved in the warning, that would be considered a hasra suffix. Person, when they give a hasra, a proper warning, they have to say, if you're going to do this action, the result of your action is going to be as follows, and you'll get malchus. Now you can't say, if you're going to do this action, it depends. If something like this happens, you'll get malchus. If something like that happens, you won't get malchus. That's called hasra suffix. You're giving a warning which really depends on a number of different variables. Under such a circumstance, he can't get malchus. So therefore, it seems like this from this Gemara, if he did complete the bia, then there would be a third set of malchus, which indicates that even if we're not certain that she'll become pregnant through this interaction, nevertheless, that would be enough for him to get the third set of malchus. Masav Rava. Rava has the following question. Almana ugrusha loke mishum shnei shemos. If a person marries a woman who happens to be a widow and a divorcee, so she's been married before, she got divorced, and she became a widow, so she's not qualified to marry a Kohen Gadol. Now, what does it say? It says he loke mishum shnei shemos. It sounds like he gets malchus once because she's an almana, once because she is a grusha. My love. Shnei shemos v'sulo. It sounds like he gets two malchus, one because she's an almana, one because she's a grusha. But according to our Gemara, the Kohen Gadol marries an almana, he gets two malchus just because she's an almana. So in this case, he should get four sets of malchus. He should get two because she's an almana and two because she's a grusha. So why does it say mishum shnei shemos? The Gemara says lo shnei shemos al zeh v'shnei shemos al zeh. When the Gemara says he gets malchus because of two reasons, it means 2 plus 2, and therefore, yes, this guy is going to be pretty well beaten up by the time we're done with this. Gemara says, hold on a second. If that's the case, he gets 4 sets of malchus when he marries a woman who is an almana and a grusha. Let's learn the end of that brisa. It says over there that she's a grusha v'chalutza. If she had chalitza, that means that her husband died before she had any children. She fell to yibam and instead she did chalitza. So she got herself out of marrying her brother-in-law by doing chalitza, and then she got divorced. It says over there, chayiv ala achas. The Mishnah over there ends off by saying he only gets malchus once for marrying this one. Hold on a second. If that's the case, it should say, again, there should still be 2 because of the violation of marrying a grusha. Again, in chayiv ala achas sounds like in this case it's limited to 1, but from the fact that she's a grusha, there should still be 2. The Gemara says, he's only chayiv for the violation of marrying one of these people. In other words, she's a grusha and a chalutza. What the end of the Mishnah is telling us is that there's no issue oraisa of marrying a chalutza. And therefore, the 2 sets of malchus that he's going to get is only going to be because he marries a grusha, not because of the fact that she is a chalutza. In other words, but he still will get 2 sets of malchus, one because of because of lo yikach, and the other one because of lo yichalo. And indeed, there would be 2 sets of malchus. And the chiddush of the end of that Mishnah is that there's no malchus for marrying a chalutza because that is midrabanan. The Gemara says, hold on a second. The chalutza midrabanan. Are you actually telling me that there's no malchus for marrying a chalutza? And that means that a kohen who marries a chalutza does not get malchus because there's no biblical prohibition for a kohen to marry a chalutza. V'atanya, we have a brayso which says grusha. There's a prohibition for a kohen to marry a divorcee. Ainli ela grusha. The implication of the pasuk is that only if she is a grusha. Chalutza minayin. How do I know that a kohen is prohibited from marrying a chalutza? Tamalomar v'isha. The pasuk says v'isha. The additional vav, which is unnecessary, includes a chalutza. So now if there is an extra word in the Torah which tells us to add in a chalutza, so then it seems like it would be midaraisa. The Gemara says midrabanan v'kros machtabi alma. The prohibition for a kohen to marry a chalutza is an isra midrabanan, and they just leaned their din midrabanan on a pasuk. In other words, it's not clear that this is midaraisa. This really opens up a discussion, a wider discussion, for what is an isra machtabi alma. And there's a very famous Ritva, Maseches Rosh Hashanah, where the Ritva says that whenever we find this concept that something is midrabanan, v'kras machtabi alma, what that really means is that the Torah gave Chazal certain halachos and said it only becomes nis midaraisa once Chazal reveal it to us. So it's an interesting opinion. It's a very big chiddush from the Ritva, because Ritva essentially elevates every time the pasuk, the Gemara says that it's midrabanan v'kros machtabi alma, to say that it's essentially an isra midoraisa. However, it was an isra midoraisa that was placed in the hands of chachamim to either enact or not to enact. If they enact this din, it becomes nis midoraisa, and they fit into the pasuk. The simple understanding is not like that. The simple understanding is that Chazal felt the importance, the need to institute certain dinim midrabanan, and in order to give it more strength, they gave it more strength by saying, by the way, I want you to know, it's not just coming from thin air. Look at the pasuk. The pasuk actually indicates that there's room for more additions over here. This is a perfect example. We have an example over here where the pasuk says, V'isha grusha v'chalutza, V'isha, and the V'isha, the extra V'isha that is used, it doesn't say chalutza in the pasuk. V'isha, grusha. It says V'isha, doesn't have to say V'isha. Chazal say the fact that it says an extra Vav over there is where we found our source to add in an extra case, and therefore it does remain midrabanan. Practically speaking, we see from our Gemara that it's treated like a drabanan. There's not going to be malchus for a kohen who marries a chalutza. But if he does marry a grusha, then there will be two sets of malchus, one because of lo yikach, another one because of lo yichalal. And potentially there could be a third one if he has a complete bia with her. Amar Aryeh. Aryeh goes on to say, Kiddush, what if he just did Kiddushin? The halacha is loka. Because as we said before, that there is a separate isser to marry her. So he says, Aryeh mukadeshas libe tabazu, kadas Moshe Yisrael, which is essentially a problem because it's really not kadas Moshe Yisrael. But he says, Aryeh mukadeshas li, and Aryeh immediately comes in and says, Malchus, even though he did not have bia. Baal, if he has bia with her, loka. So according to Aryeh, the Kiddushin and the bia are independent. You don't need one or the other. The Kiddushin's a problem, and there's a separate malchus for the Kiddushin. The bia is a problem, and there's a separate malchus for the bia. Kiddush loka, if he is mekadosh or if he marries her, he gets malchus mishum lo yikach, because the pasuk clearly says lo yikach, and he violated that. Baal loka, if he has bia with her, the halacha is he gets malchus. Why? Mishum lo yichalal. The pasuk clearly says lo yichalal. So therefore, according to Aryeh, the bia and the kiddushin are independent of one another, and therefore the malchus can be separate. Rava Amar, Rava says, hold on a second. Baal loke, lo baal in a loke. Rava essentially says the whole thing depends on whether there's going to be bia. In other words, yes, there is a violation of lo yikach, but says Rava, if he's not going to eventually have bia with her, then there's no malchus altogether. Why? Mishum d'chsiv lo yikach v'lo yichalal. Rava says, the pasuk says lo yikach v'lo yichalal, and Rava understands matam lo yikach. What's the reason why he's not allowed to marry her? Mishum lo yichalal, because if he does marry her, he's going to defile her. Now, therefore, says Rava, if he doesn't end up having the bia with her, he doesn't defile her. So therefore, even though he was mekadesh her and he shouldn't have, but it's really waiting, it's dependent on him defiling her. If he's not going to be mechalal her, there's not going to be any malchus altogether. Now the Gemara says, Umoda Aryeh. Aryeh, who told us that they're independent, is going to agree b'machzir grushaso she'im kidesh v'lo baal she'eino loka. If a person, this is referring even to a Yisrael, the halacha is that if a Yisrael divorces his wife, there's a mitzvah to be machzir grushasa, to marry her again afterwards. However, that mitzvah actually only extends to the point that she did not marry somebody else. If she did marry somebody else, then not only is there no mitzvah for him to remarry her, he's not allowed to remarry her. So here we have an example of a forbidden relationship for a Yisrael, a Machzir Gushase. Rabbi explains, because it says in the pasuk, "Lekachta lios lo leisha amarachmana v'haleka." So Abaye says, in such a case, it says clearly, "Lekachta lios lo leisha," and that's not possible, and therefore Abaye says it's going to depend on lios lo leisha, that she should be able to be an eligible person to be married. Moda Rava will agree, but Kohen Gadol ba'almana, when talking about a Kohen Gadol marrying an almana, she'imba v'lo kidesh, if he has bia with her, v'lo kidesh, and he did not marry her, in that case, even though Rava usually says that they're dependent on one another, in such a case, shaloka, he will get malchus. Why? Because in that case, there is a pasuk which is clear. It says, "Lo yichalol zaro ba'amav amarachmana b'harehu chilo." Pasuk tells us he should not defile the children in the nation, and ultimately, if he has bia, that is what it takes in order to be mechal to defile the children, and therefore, even if there's no Kiddushin, it's a problem. B'shnei yemodin, they both agree. B'machzir grushaso she'imba v'lo kidesh she'eno lo. Both agree that if we're talking about a person who returns his divorced wife in a case where he's not allowed to, in other words, where she married somebody else, if all he did was bia and not Kiddushin she'eno loka, there is no malchus if the person has a intimate relationship with the woman that he divorced who already married someone else. And again, it's talking about where she got divorced from that second person, or the second husband died. In such a case, there's no malchus if there is that bia. Why? Because derech likuchen asra Torah, the Torah only forbade that relationship in a case where it is derech likuchen through marriage. If there's no marriage there, it's just simply that having a physical interaction. In such a case, is not going to be malchus for the iser of machzir grushaso. The Gemara continues. Going back to the Mishnah that we had on the top of yesterday's Amud. So the Mishnah, again, just a quick reminder, told us that we're just going to quickly recap so we remember what we're talking about. We talked about at the top of Ayin Zayin, said, Bas Chalal Zachar Pesula Min HaKahuna. The daughter of a male Chalal, so a Chalal is the product of an illegitimate Kohanic marriage. The halach over there is the male children maintain the status of Chalal. And the Mishnah continued, Yisrael shenasa Chalala, if Yisrael marries a Chalala, bito keshera. That's the exclusion. In other words, it follows down the male path, but the female path, she could clean up the Chalal status by marrying a Yisrael. And then the Mishnah says, Chalal shnasa bas Yisrael. If a Chalal, male Chalal, marries bas Yisrael, bito pasula, his daughter maintains the status of Chalal, and therefore she's pasula kahuna. Now Rabbi Yehuda says, bas ger zachar kebas. So bas ger zachar kebas Chalal zachar. Yehuda has this chiddush that the same thing is true with the daughter of a male convert. The Gemara goes on to explain. Gemara is now going to go through a number of different cases where we're trying to learn this from, and we're going to make a bunch of comparisons. It's not as complicated as you might think it is. Just hold your head together, and we will, Eretz Hashem, get through this very exciting piece of Gemara. Yehuda Omer Basker Zachar Kbas Chalal. The male, a male. In other words, what he says is a male convert is pretty much similar to a male Chalal, and therefore the daughter will maintain that status. Tanya, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Bas Ger Zachar Kebas Chalal Zachar, the daughter of a male Ger is the same thing as a male Zachar. Hadin Osin explains this is just something which is a logical inference. It's a Kavachomer we can understand just by learning other halachas. Ma Chalal, if you look at a Chalal, Shabami Tipa Keshera, a Chalal came from a tipa kashera. In other words, the relationship was from someone who was kosher, from a kohen, and still the halacha is bito pesula. his child is going to be problematic. Ger sheba mitipa pasula, a ger whose parents were not Jewish, enodin shebita pasula would make sense. Again, the chalal came from a regular Kohen marriage. His father was a kosher Kohen, and still his child maintains the status of a chalal. So wouldn't you say, obviously, that if a child comes from a tipa psula, in other words, from a non-Jewish tipa, then the child will be pasul? Didn't Shabita Psul, the Gemara says, hold on a second. You're missing a very important point. Malachalal shekeni tziraso ba'avera. A chalal, the creation, the conception of that child, happened through a marriage which was prohibited. That marriage wasn't allowed to take place. But in this case, we're talking about two non-Jews getting married and having a child. There's nothing wrong with that. There's no avera for two non-Jews to get married. So it's true that we might be referring to a tipa psula, which means that the parents weren't Jewish, but they didn't do anything wrong by getting married. That's what they're supposed to do. Gemara says, Kohen Gadol ba'amani ochiach. Well, look at a Kohen Gadol and amana. She'ein yitzirasu ba'avera. The Kohen Gadol, he happened to have married an almana, which was a problem. But his yitzir, the Kohen Gadol himself, there's nothing wrong with his yitzir, with his creation, and still bito psula, his daughter is going to be a problem. And so the Gemara says, well, hold on. Mala Kohen Gadol ba'amana can't be asa ba'avera. You're talking about a Kohen Gadol getting married to an almana, you're forgetting the fact that interaction between the Kohen Gadol and the almana is a problematic interaction. The Gemara says, go back to the case of chalal. In that case, there's nothing wrong with it. There's no isser that takes place over there. But I didn't know saying, and we're just going to go back and forth and say the case of ger, chalal, and Kohen Gadol, all those cases are going to be different. Lo re'izeh k're'izeh. None of them are exactly the same. Tzad hashava shebehen. What is the tzad hashava shebehen? She'enon berov hakahal. There's something different about all these relationships over here. Again, the ger's parents weren't Jewish. We're talking about the chalal, where there was a problem in the conception, and then the Kohen Gadol, there was a problem in the relationship. Ger as well is not barov kal, is not part of the majority of the congregation just because of his parents, and therefore his daughter should be pasul. Gemara says, hold on a second, that doesn't work. In the case of chalal and amar and Kohen Gadol, in both of those cases, there was a problem. The reason why the chalal exists in the first place is because the marriage was illegitimate, and therefore it produced the chalal. The same thing is true by amar and Kohen Gadol. There's a problem in that relationship. They're not allowed to be in this relationship together. Whereas a ger, what's the problem? Nothing wrong was done there. His parents are not Jewish, and therefore they engaged in a perfect relationship. And Baruch Hashem, this person decided to live tachas kanfei Ashchina. What's wrong with what happens over here? The Gemara says, you know what? You're right. We're not going to be able to prove it from those cases. Lo temek Kohen Gadol b'amani ochiach. We have to retract. Let's not say that we're learning anything from a Kohen Gadol who marries an almana, because that's a problem. An almana marrying a Kohen Gadol is a relationship which never should take place. Mitzri Rishon Yochiach. Let's look at Mitzri Rishon. The halacha is a Jew is not allowed to marry a Mitzri in the first 3 generations. Now that means even if the Mitzri converts, still they are not Ro'oi Lavoi Bakal. They can't marry into the Jewish generation until 3 generations happen. So what happens? The Mitzri has to marry another Mitzri, and then the Mitzri has to marry another Mitzri, and then in the 3rd generation they can marry B'Kal Hashem. So now, Mitzri Rishon, the first generation of Mitzri, there's nothing wrong in that relationship. He marries another Mitzri. He's allowed to marry another Mitzri. He's Jewish, he marries another Mitzri, but still what happens? His child is a Mitzri Sheni. And a Mitzri Sheni can't marry a Jew. So we're talking about a case where there's no Isser in the relationship. He's a Mitzri, she's a Mitzri. They both marry each other as Mitzri Rishonim. There's nothing wrong in that marriage, but still the product is Mitzri Sheni, the 2nd generation of Mitzri, is still going to be disqualified. Gemara says, well, you can't prove anything from there. Malha Mitzri Rishon shekain ein roy lav b'kal. You're forgetting a very important point over here. A Mitzri Rishon can't marry into Kal Hashem, but a ger can. A typical ger can marry into Kal Hashem. So what's the comparison? The Gemara says, well, We could prove it from Chala, because he is royal of the Bakal. But Chazar Adin, we're going to say the same thing again. Lori Izek, Izek, they're not exactly the same. There's something which is not like the majority of the Kal Hashem, Ubito Psula, and their daughter is going to be Pasal. Afani of Yesager, Sheinabrov Kal Bito Psula, says Rabbi Yehuda, therefore I'll bring in Ger, and I'll say that since it's not Barov Kal, his daughter is going to be disqualified. The Gemara says again, there's a problem with this. In all those cases, having that bia, that relationship, is going to disqualify the person. When a person has a relationship with any of these people, it defiles the woman who's involved in that relationship. But no one's going to say, at least the Gemara thinks at this point, no one's going to say that if a ger has a relationship with the Bas Yisrael, that would have any problem in the Bas Yisrael being able to marry a Kohen. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda has this massive chiddush, which is really singly owned by Rabbi Yehuda, which is that if a Bas Yisrael marries a convert, then that disqualifies her from marrying a Kohen, and therefore, since he holds of that halacha, he could actually build this comparison and find these common denominators between those cases, and therefore, the Mahatzad Mehaidina, he could make a Mahatzad, draw these common denominators, and then make his Kal Vachomer. But again, that's going to be Rabbi Yehuda's halacha, but that's not the typical halacha according to everybody else. Now, going back to the Mishnah again, the Mishnah went on and gave a number of different opinions. The Mishnah said, according to Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov, he says, Yisrael shenasa giyores, Yisrael who marries a giyores, bito kesher l'kahuna. The daughter is able to marry a Kohen. The ger shenasa bas Yisrael, ger who marries a bas Yisrael, bito kesher l'kahuna. Aval ger shenasa giyores, but he says, if a ger marries a giyores, then bito pesul l'kahuna, the daughter cannot marry a Kohen. And then echad ger, vechad avadim, v'shachoram afilu adis yudoros, that's what the Mishnah says. And then we have Rabbi Yossi's opinion at the end, which is Af ger shenasa gioras, even a ger who marries a gioras, two converts who get married, and they have a child, bito kesher l'kahuna. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, of Rabbi Yossi. Sorry. Now the Gemara is going to analyze this. Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov Omer, Tanya, Mishnah brings a brisa. Shimon ben Yochai Omer, Shimon ben Yochai says, Gioras pichusa mibas shalosh shanim v'yom echad. This is the biggest Kiddush out of everybody. According to Shimon ben Yochai, a Gioras, in other words, a girl who was born not Jewish, and she converted under the age of 3 years old in one day, she herself is kosher to kahuna. And he brings a raya from a pasuk. Now, just like what would be the logic behind this? The logic behind this is if someone converts as an adult, so the assumption is that that person was involved in relationships while they weren't Jewish, which would technically make the person, the woman, into a zona. Now again, she wasn't Jewish, and therefore she was not keeping the halachas of the Torah. And therefore we assume that if she wasn't Jewish, not keeping the halachas of the Torah, then she has become a zona, and therefore she's disqualified from marrying a Kohen. Says Shimon ben Yochai, under the age of 3, even if technically you could think that she had an intimate relationship at that age, that's not considered, that does not turn her into a zona because she's too young and the body is still developing. And the Besulim will come back. So now he brings the raya from a pasuk. Shenemar, for it says in the pasuk, V'chol hataf benashim hach yu lachem. Moshe Rabbeinu was talking to Klal Yisrael by the Mechama in Midyan. He said, all the female children you should keep alive, you can keep them alive for yourself. Now, V'alo Pinchas haya imahem. Pinchas was a Kohen. And still, Moshe said, you can keep all the children alive. Now, if he's saying you keep all the children alive for you, that seems to say that you're going to marry them. So they'll get older and you'll marry them. Why are you keeping them? Why are you allowed to keep them alive to marry them? The answer seems to be because they will join Am Yisrael. They'll become converts. They'll become gerim. And ultimately, you'll be allowed to marry them. Now, if he was talking to everybody, Pinchas included, that means he was saying even Kohanim can marry these converts if these girls converted under the age of 3. Now, the Rabbanim who disagree with him say, Hach yu lachem doesn't necessarily mean that you'll keep them alive for yourself to get married to them. It means la'avadim l'shvachas. Maybe they could either serve as avadim l'shvachas or they could marry the avadim l'shvachas, but ultimately it doesn't necessarily mean that Pinchas HaKohen was able to marry them. The Gemara says, "V'kulan." All these opinions that we have, mikra echad darshu. They darshan this from one pasuk, and they understood it differently. What does the pasuk say? Almana ugrusha lo yikchu lehem nashim. L'nashim ki'im besulos mizera beis Yisrael. So this is a pasuk in Yechezkel. The pasuk says, "An almana and a grusha should not be lo yikchu lehem. They should not be taken by a kohen gadol as a wife. Rather, ki'im besulos mizera beis Yisrael. A kohen gadol is going to have to marry a besula, a virgin." Rabbi Yehuda says, "Ad de'is kol zera mi Yisrael." Rabbi Yehuda, who's the most strict opinion, says all of the conception needs to be mi Yisrael, so two Jewish parents. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov savar mi zera afil mikta zera. Eliezer ben Yaakov says mi zera, that means even if part of the zera, that means one parent. Yossi savar mi shenizru bi Yisrael. Yossi says doesn't have to be that the parents were always Jewish. It just means shenizru bi Yisrael, which means that this child was conceived when both parents were Jewish. So therefore, if both parents, even if both parents are converts, but now they're Jewish, and therefore there's no problem. Shimon ben Yochai savar mi shenizru bisul leha bi Yisrael. Shimon ben Yochai, who is the most lenient opinion, says even if this child's physical conception happened before she was Jewish, but if her, let's just call it the solidification of her besulim, happened when she was Yisrael, that means she turned 3 as a Jewish girl, that's fine, and she can marry a Kohen Gadol. Now that we darshan this pasuk, the Gemara is going to try to understand something in the pasuk. Amalei Rav Nachman Rava. Turn to the top of Ayin Chesam Beis. Haikra, this pasuk that we darshaned, Reisha bekohen gadol, the Seifa bekohen hedye. There's a problem with this pasuk. The first half seems to be talking about a kohen gadol, and then it switches. What does he mean? Because if you read the pasuk says, "Va'almana ugrusha lo yikchu lahem nashim." Almana and grusha. If you can include the word almana, that by definition is referring to a Kohen Gadol, because there's no prohibition for a regular Kohen Hedyu to marry an almana. It's only a Kohen Gadol. So clearly the pasuk is referring to a Kohen Gadol. But if you keep on reading the pasuk, it says, "Ki im besulos mizera beis Yisrael v'almana shartia almana mi kohen yikachu." The end of the pasuk says, "V'almana ashartia almana mi kohen yikachu." And a woman who is a widow from a Kohen can marry a Kohen. So hold on. The beginning says you can't marry an almana. The second half of the pasuk says you can marry an almana. What's going on here? So now it makes sense because the beginning must be talking about a Kohen Gadol. A Kohen Gadol cannot marry an almana. The latter half of the pasuk must be referring to a Kohen Hedyet who is allowed to marry an almana. But the interesting thing the Gemara just points out is that Haikra Reisha b'Kohen Gadol and Seifa b'Kohen Hedyet. It just switches in the middle of the pasuk without giving any warning that we're switching who we're talking about. Amar Lei, so you said back to him, Rabbi said, yeah, that's okay. This sometimes happens, that a pasuk can switch topics in the middle without giving us prior warning. The Gemara says, the kasav kra'achi? Do you actually have psukim that are written like this, where the pasuk just switches in the middle and doesn't give any prior warning? Amar Lei, he said back to him, yes, we do have such psukim. The chsiv, we'll give you an example. The pasuk says, "V'ner Elokim terem yichbeh." The ner Elokim, with the fire of Hashem, terem yichbeh, will not go out. And it says, "V'shmuel shochev b'heichal Hashem," and Shmuel will lie b'heichal Hashem. Now, v'halo ein yeshiva ba'azara. So 1 second. The pasuk is talking about the ner Elokim, that it won't go out in the azara. And it says Shmuel shochev b'heichal Hashem, and Shmuel is going to be laying down or sitting or resting in the heichal Hashem. Now, if it's both referring to being in the azara, then Shmuel's not allowed to be laying there. And the only person who's allowed to lay there, Elul Malchei Beis David Bilvad. Shmuel's not part of the Malucha of Beis David. So therefore, can't be that the ner the pasuk was talking about and Shmuel being shochev are in the same place. Ella, Ner Elokim, Terem Yichba Behechal Hashem. The Ner Elokim is referring to in the Heichal Hashem. V'Shmuel Shochev, where was he? B'Komo, in his place, he was maintaining his place where he was. So the pasuk changes its tune in the middle. Now going back to this pasuk, V'Halmana Shartia Almana Mikoen Yikachu. Let's just go back. What did the pasuk in Yecheskel say? Then Almana, a widow who will be an Almana, will be a widow from a Kohen, Yikachu can marry another Kohen. The Gemara says, hold on, something's wrong here. Mikoen in, Yisrael lo. A Kohen's only allowed to marry a widow if her husband that died was a Kohen. Never found that out before. Where did we hear this idea that a Kohen's allowed to marry a widow only if her husband was a Kohen? The Gemara says, Hachi Kamar. Mi Kohen Yikachu, which means Mishar Kohanim Yikchu, which, in other words, it's not referring to the person who died. It means the Shar Kohanim, all other Kohanim, other than Kohen Gadol, are allowed to marry a widow. Tanina Mihachi, we have a brayso which states similarly, Mikohen Yikachu, when the pasuk says Mikohen Yikachu, it doesn't mean that her husband was a Kohen, rather Mishar Kohanim Yikchu, that all the rest of Kohanim are allowed to marry her as long as they're not the Kohen Gadol. Yehuda says Mina Masim L'Kohuni Yikachu. Again, Yehuda puts out this opinion, which is again his strict opinion, that if her initial husband was somebody who was able to be married to a Kohen, then yes, now the Kohen can marry her. Yehuda follows his reasoning. The Amr bas ger zachar kebas chalal zachar. He says the daughter of a male ger is like the daughter of a male chalal. Kol sh'ata nosei bito. Anybody who you're allowed to marry his daughter, ata nosi almanuso. You're allowed to marry his widow. V'chol she'iyata nosei bito. Anybody whose daughter you're not allowed to marry, can't marry his almana. And yes, according to Yehuda, what this means is, if this woman was initially married to somebody who is not allowed to be married to a Kohen, then she becomes defiled, and she cannot marry a Kohen as an almana because of her initial relationship. We learned at the end of the Mishnah that Rabbi Yossi takes the most lenient opinion in our Mishnah, which is Yossi Yomer Af Ger Shnasa Giores, even a ger, a convert who marries a Giores, the halacha is the child is allowed to marry a Kohen. As the Mishnah said very clearly, Af Gersh Nasa Gioris Bito, one second, at the end, Yossi Omer Af Gersh Nasa Gioris Bito Kisher LeKahuna, that daughter is going to be permissible to marry a Kohen. Gemara says, Amar Rav Hamnuna, Mishmei De'ula, Rav Hamnuna stated clearly, in the name of Ula, Halacha Rabbi Yossi. The halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, and therefore the halacha would be a convert who marries a convert and they have a daughter, their child is permissible to a Kohen. The Kohen can marry her. Rabbi Bar Chana said the same thing. The halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, and that child is allowed to marry a Kohen. Now the Gemara actually just reports, Umiyom Shechar Beis HaMikdash, from the day that the Beis HaMikdash was destroyed, Nagu Kohanim Silsul Ba'atzman, the Kohanim elevated themselves, and therefore, they did not marry the child of a convert. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, just like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Amar Nachman, Amar Lihuna, Bal Imla. They paskin like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, and they don't marry the child of a convert unless one of the parents were born Jewish. Amar of Nachman says, Amar Lihuna. Huna told me the following. This is how to deal with the situation. Limlach, if they come to ask the question, Morim lo Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Nasa ein motziin osa mimenu Rabbi Yossi. In other words, the strict halacha is like Rabbi Yossi, and therefore, if a person decided to get married, Kohen decided to marry the child of a convert, of two converts, we don't get involved, and that's fine. But if they come to ask, we say you should just know the minig of the Kohanim, they have accepted upon themselves this minig not to marry such a child. The Mishnah continues. Ha'omer b'ni zeh mamzer. A person says, this son of mine, he is a mamzer. Now what the halacha is, Eino Ne'eman. He doesn't have the Ne'emanis. He's not. We don't give him the ability to be able to make such a statement about his own child. Why? Because he's saying Eidos over here, and he's related. So therefore, his edus doesn't work. Rashi says that clearly, Eino Neman, why Dekarov hu etzlo? He is a relative of this child. Ve'eino kasher lahayed alav. He can't say any edus on this person. Va'afilu shneim modim ala uber shebeme'ah. Even if both, the husband and the wife, both say, we're letting you know, this child that this woman is pregnant with, so both the husband and the wife say, this child that is being carried right now is a mamzer, because it is the product of a relationship, a forbidden relationship outside of the marriage. If they both say, modim al uber shebeme'ah mamzerhu, einom ne'emanim, they're not believed. Yehuda omer ne'emanim, Yehuda says they are believed. So if both a husband and a wife come to Beis Din and say, Mazel Tov, there is a pregnancy over here, and they say, but we're letting you know, this pregnancy did not happen between husband and wife, rather, she stepped out of the marriage and she became pregnant with another person. According to the first opinion, we say, thank you very much, we don't believe you, and according to Yehuda, we will believe them. Gemara says, hold on a second. What's the additional point that even if both of them say it? In other words, if he's not believed and she's not believed, so then it's really 0 plus 0 equals 0. Why is there an extra Kiddush in saying that even if both of them say that this child is a mamzer? They're both related to the child, and therefore if he's not if he's not believed, she's not believed. So what's the addition? What is the additional Kiddush in the fact that two people who are not believed will still not be believed? Gemara says, Lomi by Kamar. It's really just giving us additional information that we didn't need. Lomi by, I don't even need to tell you, Ihu delay Kimle, he is not believed because he doesn't know what happened. Again, he's reporting and saying that this child is not from me. But he wasn't there to know what happened. He can't tell you how she became pregnant. Afilu ihi, even her dekimla, she should have some element of trustworthiness in this case because she knows what happened. Still, lo menhemno, she is not believed. V'lo bai, and we also don't need to tell you hechad de isla lecheskas kashrus. When the child was already born, every single yid is born with a cheskas kashrus. We assume that everybody is a kosher child. And still, if the child is born that way, a father can't say, hey, this child, who otherwise would have assumed is a kosher child, is a mamzer. The lo mehemni is not believed to say that. Elafilu, uber, a fetus was not born yet. If you're not born yet, you can't have a cheskas kashrus. The less lechazaka, the kashrus lo mehemni. In other words, the point is to bring out these two points. Number one, you might think she's more trustworthy because she's the one who had the relationship, and therefore she should be able to tell you who the father of this child is and whether this child is a mamzer. Still, we don't believe her because she's not ne'emenes to ruin the child's life. And the second chiddush is that you might think that the only time they're not believed is when the child was born already with a cheskas kashrus, and that's why they're not believed. The Gemara says, the Mishnah is teaching you that no, even if the child is not born yet, and it's just, in other words, you would think that if the child is not born, in that case they would be believed because he has no cheskas kashrus. The chiddush of the Mishnah is they're still not believed, despite the fact that the child has no cheskas kashrus because he wasn't born. Yehuda omer nemanim. Yehuda says they are believed. Kiddushin, where does he get this from? Why does he say that they are believed? He says because we have a pasuk. Kiddushin yakir. The pasuk tells you when it comes to the dinim of Yerusha, Kies habachar ben hasnua yakir. The father can recognize who the bachar is. The Gemara says yakirenu lacherim. Vidarshan yakir means he can make him recognizable to others. Mikana Rabbi Yehuda from Yehuda says from here we learn neman adam lomar zebni bachar. A person is believed to say that this is my bachar. Why is that relevant? Because the Bechar gets more money. He gets a double share. Ukeshem, he goes on to say, Ukeshem ne'eman adam lomar, zebni Bechar. Just like a person has the ne'emanas, he is believed. He is able to make a statement that this is my oldest child. Kach ne'eman adam lomar, zeben grusha v'zeben ben chalutza. He can say that this child was born through an illegitimate relationship. Chachamim disagree and say, Eino ne'eman, he is not believed. Amalei Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak l'Rava. Hold on a second. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak says to Rava, Bishlam l'Rabbi Yehuda hainu d'chsev yakir. We understand why, according to Rabbi Huda, it says the word yakir. El Rabbanan, yakir lamali. What do you need yakir for? Gemara says, b'tzara hekera. It's a case where we need to have some type of heker. So what's it relevant for? Like we pointed out before, lasis lo pishnayim, to give this child a double inheritance. Gemara says, pshita. Why do you need to have ne'emanos to give a kid a second share of inheritance? What do we need a pasuk for? Migudi boy mesuv lev matana milo yavle. In other words, we're talking about his money. So if the father should be ne'eman to say, listen, you don't want to believe me that he gets a double inheritance? I'll give him the gift right now. It's my money. The Gemara says we're talking about we're talking about possessions that came after the father already made the statement that he is his oldest child. The Gemara says, all right, that's essentially dvarim shelo bal olam. So we understand why you need to have a pasuk. But according to Rabbi, person could say, "This is my oldest child, and therefore everything that I will ever own will be subject to a double inheritance for him." Yakir lamali. Why do you need to have the pasuk of yakir? In other words, why does the pasuk need to give you a special ability to recognize the oldest child? Goses is talking about when these nechasim came into his possession while he was a goses, and there's a number of different understandings as what the problem over there is, but the simple understanding is, in Rabbi Meir, according to Rabbi Meir, even if you could go ahead and be makna davar shelo bal olam, that's not going to be true when he's a goses, because we're talking about a person who's going to die soon, and therefore things that are going to come in the future will come after he dies. We'll stop here. Have a wonderful day. You have the, what are you on yours?
Just send me yours just in case.